Ever wondered what's inside a super shoe or why they're so astronomically expensive? Well, we're about to find out. Today we're going to take a look inside the Nike Vaporfly Next Percent, the Adidas Boston 10 and the KIPRUN KD900X. So let's get into it. Saw please. Let's go. Okay, roll on Andy Cam because I like to talk about myself in the third person. We've worn and worn and worn these shoes, so they are definitely at the end of their running life. We didn't want to cut up brand new shoes, but we did want to be able to show you what's inside.
2 hours later.
That was significantly more physically tiring, slightly embarrassing. We've cut 3 different shoes up, both longitudinally, so along the length of the shoe, and directly in half. There was loads of stuff that I noticed as I was cutting through them, lots of different densities of foam. The tech inside is actually really different. The Vaporflys, cutting them in half through the middle here, actually, you can probably see that at the midsection here, the carbon plate's actually not that thick. It's quite a long way from the base of the shoe, and it doesn't cover the full width, which really surprised me as I was cutting through it. And it's quite hard work to cut through. The carbon plate's actually pretty tough, they're very stiff. And then as I was cutting through it as well, it exposes the way that these shoes are made. So you've got a one-piece upper. If you want a little bit more information on that, I actually went to the factory, to the R&D department in Lille to check out how these are made, so you get to see the uppers before they're even attached to a shoe. And then there's some really strong stitching here that sews them onto a second piece, which is then glued onto the sole itself, so the midsole. So you can see with the Vaporfly, it's one density of foam. It's the Pebax ZoomX foam, which is incredibly famous and now kind of commensurate, like everyone associates that with what a super shoe is. I mentioned that the Nike plate doesn't cover the full width of these shoes, and I find them great at top speed, but if I run a little bit slower, I find them a little bit wobbly and a little bit wishy-washy. So for me, that could be something that's influenced by the technology here, that they've deliberately made a decision, maybe for weight, maybe for stiffness, for the plate not to be quite the full width of the foam. And does that make it less stable? I don't know. Adidas have put a whole plate in the heel of the Boston 10 just to make it more stable. Not only have you got 2 different densities of foam here, now this is a slightly cheaper shoe, so it's much heavier. You've got Adidas's Light Strike Pro on the top, which is a more expensive foam from the Adidas Pro, and then the EVA version closer to the road, I guess, where you'd be running. But the biggest and most striking difference is the totally different technology inside here. So Adidas in their super shoes uses these rods, the energy rods, versus a single plate for Nike. And actually Adidas have combined this with a carbon plate in the rear foot. So actually you probably can't quite see it here, but it finishes only about a centimetre into the forefoot section that I've got here. And the rest of it is in this midsole section here. So you've got 5 plates. These are made of nylon because it's the cheaper version. It's not the Adidas Pro, which is the more expensive version. So they're made of nylon, not carbon. They're all quite tough to saw through actually, but Adidas have chosen to use a carbon plate in the heel section, coupled with these 5 energy rods to provide that stiffness as you roll through, and 2 different densities of foam. So there's quite a lot of technology here in arguably a cheaper, heavier training shoe rather than a pure racing shoe. Compare that again to the cheaper shoe, I suppose, which I actually tested really favorably, which is the Decathlon KD900X from KIPRUN. One of the big differences here, if you take a look at the comparison between the Nike and the Decathlon, is that the carbon plate itself is much closer at the midsection of the shoe here, much closer to the floor, to the road, within the foam in the Decathlon shoe, versus Nike's where it's centralized. And similarly, the Decathlon one is much wider. So totally different technology. And then just noticing things as I go along here, the Decathlon shoe has holes drilled into the midsole foam in both the forefoot and the rear foot. I imagine that must be to save weight because this foam is a totally different density to the foam in the Nike shoe. They're actually made by the same manufacturer of Pebax foam, but they're totally different. You can see the open cell nature of the foam in the Decathlon shoe. You can actually see the individual cells of foam as it's been formed versus the completely uniform homogeneous foam in the Nike ZoomX foam. Despite them coming from the same manufacturer of foam and aim to do the same thing. But the Decathlon one is much stiffer. This one is much softer and gives you much more bounce. Obviously cutting these shoes in half doesn't mean I can run in them anymore, but I have tested all of these shoes. So stay tuned to find out a little bit more about how this technology actually translates onto the road. This has been terrifying for me, cutting up all of these individual shoes. It feels like sacrilege and I've made such a mess. If you like what we're doing, please make sure you subscribe to the channel. Give us a like as well, because that makes a massive difference. And now I better make it worthwhile and dive back into some of the information about the different shoes. So what I think is then really interesting as I was cutting them open is you see big differences going through the middle of the shoe like this. But then when you look side on, I guess you see the magic that makes this happen. So the biggest thing here with the Nike shoe is the profile of the carbon plate. It's not actually that wide, as I said, but the flex is it takes it very close to the floor, to the blown rubber on the outsole here, and then flexes back up away to sit much closer to your actual foot as you approach the heel at the back of the shoe. And I know that these designs are patented, so the flex that this foam gives you and the way that it returns energy has been developed by all of the scientists. So it's this curvature within the carbon plate and the stiffness in combination with the foam, which ultimately makes them fast or not. And then compare that to the cross-section of the Adidas shoe, looking at the same thing, it just looks totally different. The way that the structure of the foam is put together, the two different foams visually look really different. And then you've got part of a rod sticking out here. You've got the carbon plate, which I said only goes through the rear foot here to provide that extra stability, which potentially having rods doesn't change the way that, or doesn't allow protection from a torsion perspective, a twisting of the foot. So the one thing you can't really see is exactly where the Adidas rods go from this cut through. You can see one's been sawn off here, and then you can see one flexing here very close to, well, the exposed section here, very close to the rubber. Compare that to the Decathlons, you can actually see that the curvature of the carbon plate itself is totally different. You've got almost a subtle S shape in the Nike one, where it's just one big sweeping curve in Decathlons. So again, different foam compound, different material slightly of carbon plate, because they'll each have their own patented design, and then a totally different shape, aiming to achieve the same result. So that's why the shoes physically feel different when you run in them. Nike chose not to expose their plate, so it's completely hidden within the shoe, whereas now shoes are choosing to kind of show the technology so you know what you're buying. Decathlon showed the carbon plate here, so you can actually see the fibers in the carbon plate. And then just a closing note, I suppose, is how does the technology work? Ultimately, it's the magic combination of the stiffness of the carbon plate and then the right compound of foam for that stiffness. So that's something that a lot of research and testing goes into. I mentioned the lab visit to Lille earlier on. That was an incredible eye-opener just for a company like Decathlon, where I think there's a perception of them being a bit more budget. The amount of R&D spend that went into developing their super shoe, and then think about the scale of the companies we're looking at here with Nike and Adidas. The testing, the science, the simulations that they use digitally before they even actually make a model, that's what works out how the different curvature of the plate in combination with the softness or firmness of the foam is going to make you faster. Cutting up shoes is terrifying, but it's the only way to see what's inside them. I've tested all of these shoes. Have you tested any of them? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to find out how I got on when I compared directly the performance of the KD900X in its full form with the Vaporfly, again in its full form, the Next% 2, then click here.